Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Laura Bryant. Welcome to another program in the Mirawood Center's highly popular Presidential Legacy series. So far, we have featured 6 presidential libraries: Lincoln, LBJ, Truman, FDR, Carter, and Ford. This morning, Richard Weld, Education Specialist at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, is covering the final section of our 3-part series highlighting President Ford and his wife, First Lady Betty Ford. In February, Richard kicked it off with part 1, the early years. Last month was the DC years, and today is part 3, after the White House. Thank you, Richard. This has been a fascinating look back at how Jerry and Betty Ford managed political challenges and historical milestones that still resonate today. We're looking forward to learning even more about how the Fords continued to grow their political and personal legacies after leaving the White House. Okay, thanks, Richard.
You got it. Thank you all for being here today. It's good to see you. As mentioned, I'm Richard Weld, for those of you I didn't see before. I'm from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, and we're going to talk about that towards the end. But mostly today, we're going to talk about what happens after you leave the White House, which is often a heck of a question. So last time we talked about the 1976 presidential election. Jerry went into that really down in the polls, about 30 points, but brought it up and only lost the election by under 2%, which is really pretty impressive considering along the way he had managed to offend just about everybody in the country to the point where there were 2 assassination attempts on him. So I think he did a really good job with that. But considering that Gerald Ford had never wanted to be president, he'd actually never wanted to be vice president. His ideal lofty goal was Speaker of the House. And after he gave up on that, he suddenly became vice president and then president quite unexpectedly. I like to refer to that as falling backwards into the White House. So after the election, which went very well, he made a couple of little mistakes, one in a speech and one in a Texas State Fair with eating a tamale complete with the husk on. He committed himself after losing the election to a peaceful and graceful transition of power to President Carter. In fact, we have his telegram here, and this is conceding the election, November 5th, 1976. Well, actually, no, it's dated November 3rd. That's the day of the election. It was received by the Central Files Office November 5th. This is how we file things. And it basically says, as one has been honored to serve the people of this great land, both in Congress and as president, now we have to put the divisions of the campaign behind us and unite the country once again in the common pursuit of peace and prosperity. Blah, 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 continued disagreements. I want to assure you that you will have my complete and wholehearted support as you take the oath of office this January. I also pledge to you that I and all members of my administration will do all that we can to ensure that you begin your term as smoothly and effectively as possible. May God bless you and your family as you undertake your new responsibilities. Sincerely, Jerry Ford. And yeah, he signed it Jerry because, he was already transitioning out of being President Gerald Ford. The family was, did the last minute photos in the White House in the Oval Office. But then they really did start work on the transition. He hosted the Carters several times, brought all of Jimmy Carter's staff in, showed them around, rode to the inauguration together. And Jimmy Carter gave an amazing inauguration address where he actually asked Gerald Ford to stand up and receive a round of applause for all he did to patch the country back together after the problems of the Nixon administration, which was incredibly graceful of President Carter. So once that happens, the Fords retired. They left the DC area. Now, I'd love it if they came back to Grand Rapids, Michigan, but that's not how it worked out. They actually had at that point acquired 2 houses, one in Rancho Mirage, California, and one in Vail, Colorado. So here are Jerry and Betty with the kids. And this is in their California home, I believe. And so they retired. And after that, there's sort of the general belief that Gerald Ford mostly just played golf. That's not entirely inaccurate. I mean, what else do you do after you've been the president of the United States? Well, he did write his memoir, autobiography. but he did play a lot of golf. He was retired. That's what he did. He's like, I'm done. I really don't need to be involved in politics anymore. I say that that's also not entirely true either. Now, let's go back and look at some of the presidents after the presidency. FDR passed away in the office. Truman, it was said, was broke after he left the White House, but that's not actually quite true. He did struggle a little financially. Then he started writing books and people started, being more interested in what happens after you're president. Eisenhower published a couple of autobiographies. JFK passed away in the office, obviously, or was killed in the office. Johnson actually only lived 4 years past his presidency. Nixon, let's just say that Nixon kept his head down after the presidency. So Gerald Ford, in about 30 years, an entire generation, was really one of the first presidents to have much opportunity to do things after he left the White House. So he started getting involved in corporate boards. He did a lot of public speaking. He wrote his autobiography, and he actually monetized his post-presidency period as few modern presidents had ever done. He was a very active participant in things like boards and speaking opportunities and talking at schools and serving on things. One of the things that more modern presidents tend to do, he was really the first person to kick that off. Now, politically, he kept things pretty low-key. He did receive briefings from President Carter's administration, security briefings, and he served as an advisor to President Carter. But he generally stayed out of President Carter's way, did not criticize, kept his personal politics very low-key. He thought one of the best things he could do as a past president was to just get out of the way of the current guy. In fall of 1979, as they're talking about who's going to be the Republican candidate for president, his name actually came back around. They're like, well, you just barely lost to Carter last time, and things haven't gone super great under Carter. There's still some financial troubles. There's still a lot of things going on. What do you think about running again? Well, he thought about it, but by March of 1980, he officially took himself out of consideration for the Republican presidential nomination. And what he said was, America needs a new president, also referring to Carter, but also referring to himself. I've determined that I can best help that cause by not being a candidate for president, which might further divide my party. Now, nevertheless, in July at the Republican National Convention in Detroit, Michigan, representatives of Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan sat down and attempted to work out the details of having Ford on the ticket as vice president under Reagan. Now, this is something that both of them were a little not so great about. During the 76 election, remember that Reagan ran as a challenger to Ford up through the convention, and Ford had to beat Reagan to become the actual candidate. The two of them have had some beef ever since then about that. And I'll be honest, it's well reputed that Nancy and Betty did not like each other at all. So basically, the talks about the two of them being on the same ticket weren't really getting anywhere. And at the last minute, Reagan decided to go with this guy named Bush instead. So Ford does what Reagan didn't do, and he goes on to support Reagan's presidential campaign. In 76, there was a lot of discussion that Reagan had drummed up all this, contention against Ford as part of his campaign. And then when Ford got the nomination, Reagan took his followers and went home. He didn't stump for Jerry. Well, Jerry did stump for Ronald Reagan. He was the bigger man on that one, and he went out there and he did all of the campaigning on behalf of Reagan for the good of the party and what he believed good of the country. And that's sort of the last time Jerry was actually involved in anything that involved an office. He's like, I'm good, I'm done. I'm not going to be president again. I'm not going to run for any other offices. I'm out. So then he did start speaking up on other causes, but he was careful about how he used his voice. He was very, very deliberate when he talked because he figured that his voice had some weight to it. He also didn't want to embarrass any sitting president. So he was very low key. One interesting thing is we know that in 2000, he became a member of the Republican Unity Coalition. If you've never heard of the Republican Unity Coalition, it was a gay-straight alliance group with the stated intention of broadening the base of the Republican Party by welcoming gay members. This makes Jerry Ford the only president, living or dead, that we know of to have joined a gay pride group. So he joins this group as a board member. And he said, you know, we need to broaden the Republican Party. We need to open up the doors. And they asked him to sign on to a letter, an open letter to be published in the New York Times. And he actually had to decline that. Hold on a second, my slides are not advancing. He declined it because he'd actually done one recently. And his reasoning is, well, I support the cause. And this was sending out an open letter in support of the Lawrence v. Texas case. But he had recently done an op-ed piece for the New York Times himself, and he didn't want to do too many things. He really needed to pace how much he used his name. So he really was very cognizant of keeping himself low-key as a political figure. Now, as with past presidents, he's being flown to funerals and for other world leaders and things like that, and he gets to do the occasional trips on Air Force One for that type of thing. But mostly he's staying out of the way of the White House, and he's limiting how much he does in public. Pretty much how he went into retirement, was just staying low-key. Now, the flip side of that is that Betty was pretty active. Mostly. After they left the White House, the family had a sit down with Betty. It actually took 2 interventions to really get her to accept that she was having a problem. In March of '77, she decided to write a book about her memoirs. She signed the same deal that Jerry did, essentially. But in April of '78, the family sat her down and said, look, you're having a problem with addiction to alcohol and prescription medication. Back in '64, Betty had pinched a nerve in her neck. She was prescribed painkillers, and she took them. But back in the day, before we really talked about how opioids can be addictive, she got hooked on painkillers. And of course, sometimes she mixed them with alcohol, which of course doubles the strength. So she was having a hard time. She went into one of the good rehab programs at the time, which was at Long Beach Naval Hospital. I found the grimmest picture I could find of Long Beach Naval Hospital. It is a concrete block building that, yes. In her memoirs, she talks about how regimented it was, how difficult it was, how they made her feel like she was a failure and a bad person for her problems. Now, this is well before she got there. This is a vintage image of it. It's now a VA hospital. It doesn't look nearly as grim. But it was a very difficult period for her. At that time, recovery programs and rehab programs basically treated you like you had failed. They really were not sympathetic. They really were not build you up. They were sort of a tear you down and make you start fresh and et cetera, et cetera. So she went into rehab. She did well. She stayed in recovery. But she wrote her autobio, Times of My Life, was published in November of '78. And she basically did everything up to and including the start of her recovery period in Long Beach. And that last chapter is real rough, if you ever have a chance to read it. It's not a good thing. But she kicks the pills, she kicks the alcohol. So she gets back on the road. By 1981, she's back working with the ERA. She's the national honorary chair of the ERA Countdown campaign, it's called. The deadline for ratification of the ERA was June 30th, 1982. So they put on this huge last-minute push. It needs to be voted on by 2/3 of the states. Now, it's through Congress. It's out to the states for voting. It misses just barely. And in fact, the deadline has since been extended, and the extension has passed as well. But after the extension passed, another state finally voted for it. So it coulda, woulda, shoulda passed, but it never became the law. But during 81 and 82, she was everywhere working on this. By the way, to her left there, she's on the center, is Lady Bird Johnson. So you get two first ladies for the price of one. So she's working on that. She's also a huge advocate for breast cancer screening and women's health. This is actually a plaque from during the presidency, but it's just such a nice one. But she's out there campaigning for that. She's a very aggressive speaker. She's saying things where a lot of other people are gasping and putting their hands over their mouth. But she's out there talking about the AIDS crisis in the 80s. She's talking about public health. She's talking about all of these other things. And the other thing she's doing, obviously we all know this one comes around. In 1981 and 82, she and her longtime friend, Ambassador Leonard Firestone, who also struggled with alcoholism, established the Betty Ford Center for the Treatment of Chemical Dependency, which was at the Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage, California. That's Mr. Firestone. She actually didn't really want her name on the building because she figured if she had had a relapse, it would reflect badly on the center. But they kind of insisted. That happens when you become the big spokesperson for something. They're going to name it after you. She led the way in raising funds, developing treatment programs, et cetera, for the center. The idea was, unlike the programs that she and Firestone went through, this would be a supportive, nurturing, caring program. And it's basically become that. She was dedicated in October of 82, and she was the chair of the board until 2005. So a lot of work went into that. That sort of becomes her main focus post-82, after the ERA unfortunately didn't pass. She was still very involved in women's health, et cetera, but the Betty Ford Center became a leading center for the treatment of addiction to alcohol, drugs, et cetera. So that's where we sort of pause talking about the two of them. And then what was going on around them is the Ford Library and Museum, which is where I come in. We preserve the story of the Fords. On Inauguration Day of 1977, the Ford presidential records and some of the gifts that President Ford had received were transferred to Ann Arbor, Michigan in 9 semi-trucks. So, a couple of things you should know. Every gift given to the president is actually the property of the United States. The president can say, I'd like to take this one with me. Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that's, okay, well, maybe you'd have to buy it off the United States, recompense, et cetera, et cetera. Mostly that's, I got this really cool thing from school kids and it's been in my office and I want to keep it. Okay, fine. But most things that come from other heads of state and are ridiculously valuable, presidents are like, yep, that's the property of the United States. We have things like this gold and jade falcon with gems all over it that was a gift from the nation of Oman. That's here in the museum. No one keeps that lying around the house. But the records themselves went to Ann Arbor, Michigan. Now, Gerald Ford, having been a congressman for over 20 years, had been participating in a University of Michigan program where he donated all of his congressional papers to the university. Well, when suddenly he became president, the National Archives got involved and said, but we're getting all your presidential records. He said, okay, fine. He wanted to have his presidential library located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on the grounds of the University of Michigan. So it is. But then he said, but I want my museum in my hometown of Grand Rapids. So it is. For those of you who don't know Michigan very well, we have this cool thing we can do with the Lower Peninsula where it's shaped like a hand. So Ann Arbor is here, Grand Rapids is here. My coworkers and I, when we have an all-staff meeting, have a 2.5-hour drive each way just to have meetings. No matter how much any president begs and whines, the National Archives is never doing this again. We are the only museum with a split location like this. Other museums complain, oh, I have to walk down the hall and across the commons and up the stairs to go to research in the stacks. And I'm like, I have to get on the car, and I have to get on the highway, and then get to the other highway and the other highway, and it's 2.5 hours. Cry a little bit harder, those of you who work at the Roosevelt Library. So I'm not real sympathetic with them. But we have 2 very nice facilities, and basically that's how that happened. Now, never, ever, ever again, but it does work out pretty well. And I will say Zoom makes a lot of the meetings easier. It's only when we need an in-person that we have to do the whole big drive, or when I'm researching documents and records that I want to scan and show to children. So let's backtrack a second and talk about the National Archives Presidential Library System. The National Archives dates back to 1934. It was established to preserve the important documents of the United States government. We house the obvious pieces in our central headquarters in Washington, D.C., in a room we call the Rotunda. I always like to quiz kids when I say this. Why do we call it the Rotunda? And very quickly they go, because it's round? And I say, yes, we're good at preserving documents. We're not very inventive with names. So if you look at this picture, off to the left-hand side of the Rotunda, you can't quite see, blocked by this nice couple in the foreground, is the Declaration of Independence. Not a copy, not a replica, the original one. Straight up ahead, where we see the lady in the orange sweater, is the Constitution of the United States, all 4 pages, original copy. And then off to the right is where we keep the Bill of Rights. So these are what we call the foundational documents, the big 3. And they're right there in Washington, D.C. But because the United States generates a lot of paperwork, we actually have locations all over the United States, 40 of them. We have storage systems, we have the presidential libraries, all that kind of thing. Now, in case you're wondering, we do actually keep some of our stuff in caves because caves are amazing. They're like climate controlled for free. It's great. But most of them are very advanced government buildings. We keep things like military records. We keep the receipt for the Louisiana Purchase, just in case France comes back around and says, hey, can we get that back? No, we have the receipt. As the kids these days say, we keep the receipts. Now, we didn't initially do presidential libraries. National Archives got created in 1934. It was actually Roosevelt in 39, FDR, who said, I've been doing all these big important programs, and it would probably be kind of important if the government had my records. So he donated his presidential records to the federal government, along with a portion of his home at Hyde Park, for the construction of the library and museum. At that time, the only other living president was Hoover, who said, well, I'd kind of like a museum. And so he gave his records to the United States government. Now, nobody before that had the opportunity to do so because all of them were dead. Most presidents prior to that had given their records to their alma maters or a library. Some presidents just actually trashed theirs. Yeah, nobody will ever care about this stuff I did. I'm done. New guy's in charge. Peace out. I'm going to go retire and fish. So it became a tradition after FDR that presidents gave their records to the government, to the National Archives. It was not required. I think we can all probably guess the first president to not give his records to the United States government, especially 18.5 minutes of recordings, sorry, I shouldn't pick on Nixon for that, but he did break the tradition by not donating his records to the United States government. He said, I am keeping these, you can't have them, none of your business. Okay. Ford did not deal with that, but under the Carter administration, they wrote what was called the Presidential Records Act, a law which says all presidents, their papers are inherently the possession of the United States government, all of their work papers, official paperwork. Carter got it started, it actually passed under the Reagan administration. So since then, all presidential papers come to the National Archives. There are now 13 presidential libraries in place and 2 that we are working on. They're in process. The Barack Obama Library, interestingly enough, is not going to have a physical location. Because the vast majority of the documents created during the Obama administration were created as digital documents, what they're going to do is digitize every other document and turn it into a completely digital library so that all of the documents will be available online, and they will have archivists who will help people find them, but they're not actually going to print the 80-something% of them that were started out as digital. For example, with the Ford Library, we have massive amounts of print film, old rolls of film, and recordings and things like that. During the Obama administration, all the pictures they took were digital. So while we slowly digitized thousands and thousands and thousands of official White House press photographs, they're like, yep, they're done. Lucky. Now, they're going to digitize much more quickly than we are. Our archivist actually has, our audiovisual archivist has an 8-track player, has a reel-to-reel player, has a VHS player, has a microfilm machine. We have things on all sorts of formats to deal with. So that's a whole challenge for our archivist. But the library and museum both opened in the early 80s, 80 and 81 officially. So we have been running ever since. We bring quite a few kids on school groups through the museum. We do public programming. We have a partner foundation, which is the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, which is our 501c3 partner, because federal agencies are not allowed to ask people for money for fundraising. That's why we have a 501 partner to do it. Their big fundraiser is actually tomorrow, the First Ladies Luncheon, and Dr. Jill Biden will be speaking at that tomorrow, followed by a conference with panels on First Ladies history. So that's the kind of thing that we're up to these days. While we were doing all of this, President Ford maintained an office at each building and would come in and work on fundraisers and would work on going through the papers and would say, no, this is from that meeting, not that meeting. It's good to have somebody who remembers these things around. But unfortunately, we have to get to the point where we talk about the end of the story. We knew it was going to come here. Gerald Ford passed away on December 26, 2006, at the age of 93 years. He had some heart problems. After lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda, the funeral service was held at the National Cathedral. He was then transported to Grand Rapids, where many people came to see the lying in state here as well, and then the burial here at the museum. We, by the way, collected most of these things that people left, from teddy bears to flags to signs. As agreed, he and Jimmy Carter made a pact. Whoever passed away first, the other one would speak at their funeral. So I'm going to play you an audio clip, and then I'm going to try not to cry.
One of my proudest moments was at the commemoration of the 200th birthday of the White House, when 2 noted historians both declared that the Ford-Carter friendship was the most intensely personal between any 2 presidents in history. This close relationship extended to our spouses, as Betty worked on drug and alcohol abuse and Rosen address the challenges of mental illness. And when those two women descended on Washington together, few members of Congress could resist their combined lobbying assault. The four of us learned to love each other. In closing, let me extend on behalf of Rosalind and me and Jack and Chip and Jeffrey and Amy and our 11 grandchildren and one great-grandson, our personal sympathy and love to Betty and Mike and Jack and Steve and Susan.
Whoops, hold on.
And all of your extended family. The tens of thousands of people who lined the highway yesterday and today were expressing this mutual love which we share for President Jerry Ford. I still don't know any better way to express it than the words I used almost exactly 30 years ago. For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he did to heal our land.
Jimmy Carter was a real class act. That is exactly what he had said when he asked Jerry to stand up at the inauguration and thanked him for all he did to heal the country. So Jerry was interred here at the museum. Betty Ford passed away of natural causes July 8th, 2011, 5 years later. She was also 93. Her first funeral service was held there in California on July 12th with a eulogy by Rosalind Carter. After being transported to Grand Rapids, Betty had a second funeral, which was held at Grace Episcopal Church, where she and Jerry had been married. It was held on July 14th, which was actually Jerry's birthday. She was then interred at the museum as well. So that's the picture of the gravesite, which is just outside our building and overlooks the Grand River. So it wasn't a bad story. It was a good long story, 93 years each. But yes, it does come to a sad conclusion. I will be happy to take any questions, though, about the lives of Jerry and Betty Ford. You can pop them in the chat or raise your hand and come off mute.
So Richard, one request, maybe take the slide down so we can see everybody.
Sure.
Easier.
I will stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you.
Fran's got her hand up.
Okay, Fran.
Well, first of all, thank you. And I was crying during that eulogy. I'm still choking. We're going to our granddaughter's graduation of U of Michigan.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
so we've decided to go to Grand Rapids and come to the museum.
You definitely should.
Is it safe to stay in downtown Grand Rapids?
Oh gosh, yes.
Okay.
I do it all the time. Well, I mean, I live in Grand Rapids, so yeah, no, it's a nice town.
Okay, well, we're coming.
Excellent. You'll have to check out a beer. We are officially Beer City, USA. You'll have to check out one of our many, many craft brews.
And how long should we figure for the visit?
Museum usually takes about an hour to walk through the galleries. I recommend spending a little time in our store because we've got a lot of cool stuff. But, you know, figure an hour and a half to 2 hours.
Okay, I'll figure 4. That's us.
That happens too. If you want to read everything and watch all the videos, 4 is a good number.
Okay, thank you.
And we've got lots of fun little restaurants, quirky places to eat around the museum.
Thank you. We're coming. I'm excited.
Excellent.
And I feel much more prepared to come after all this.
Excellent. I see a phone caller's got their hand up.
Yeah, Marilyn, you've got your hand up, and then Philip, you're next. Marilyn, you can unmute yourself.
In fact, it's the best way to do it. Yes, there you are.
I'm unmuted. Okay. Those were beautiful, beautiful comments by Carter and just a short statement. I wish things could be like that now. Anyway, when we were to talk with Susan Ford, and Lyndon Johnson's daughter spoke, and Susan talked a lot about her mom's drug addiction and how she was so active in the Betty Ford Center, and that how she helped her, and they were so close, and it was, really very, very poignant. But the question I want to ask you is, do you think that Ford's pardon of Nixon hurt him politically?
Oh,
Because
100%.
Yes, that's what I thought too. And do you think he should have pardoned him? That's a loaded question.
No, well, I personally wasn't in a position to make that decision. I was 5, but Jerry thought it was the right thing to do. And Jerry had all of his advisors telling him it was political suicide. And he sat down and he really came to, as he put it, the conclusion that the next 3 years, his entire presidency, could be about Nixon's trial, or it could be solving America's problems. And so he said, I'm going to get dinged for this, and I'm going to get hit hard. This is going to be hanging around my neck. But he had the advantage that he'd never wanted to be president. And he said to himself, I'm going to do the best job I can. And if I don't get elected in 76, to heck with it. It's my job to do the right thing, not to get not to get elected in 76. I always struggle with saying reelected, but he was never elected in the first place. So that, and the things he did where he offered clemency to draft dodgers, between the two of them, he offended both the right and the left. He offended everybody there. He had to make America eat its vegetables, is what I say, because he had to work on inflation. He had to work on New York City going bankrupt, and he denied a bailout to New York City. He said, you need to fix your many problems. Federal cash will not solve your problems. And that hit him as well. The economy was still not good when he left office. So he made America eat its vegetables, and he knew that everything he did that was tough, he was going to lose votes for. And he simply said, that's not my priority. My priority is doing what's right for America. So, yeah, it hurt him politically 100%. If he hadn't pardoned Nixon, if he hadn't offered clemency to the draft dodgers, both of which his advisors begged him not to do, he would have beaten Carter.
May I say one other thing? Michael Beschloff was on TV the other night, and he said that Nixon called a lot of people suicidal and this and that, and one of the main reasons that Ford pardoned Nixon was because he felt so sorry for him, too. That's what Michael Beschloff said.
Ford visited Nixon after Nixon left the White House, and Nixon was in incredibly poor physical health. There was some concern that he might not survive the year, literally. And considering this was August, there was an element of Jerry might not have thought Nixon would have survived the trial. But more to the point, he just, he really wanted to just clear that off the plate and move forward with the country.
Thank you.
You got it.
Thanks, Marilyn. So,
Then,
Philip, are you still here?
I think we lost Philip.
Oh, we
Just
lost
disappeared momentarily. Hopefully he'll be right back.
I hope. I'll look for him. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, I do.
Okay, hit me.
So help me understand. It was a great explanation about the presidential library.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated that timeline to create a little more understanding. Are the museums subject to same set of rules, different set of rules, no rules? How does that work?
As the libraries, or?
Well, the museums are separate from the libraries. In your case, they're actually in different cities.
Yes. So the Presidential Records Act covers the paperwork the president generates, the actual files. Now, if the president has personal correspondence or personal paperwork, those are not covered by the Presidential Record Act. However, there's a whole process for saying that this is personal, not presidential. Mm-hmm. If you get a birthday card from a friend, you can say, okay, friend, birthday card. If you get a birthday card from the Queen of England, you go, okay, that's presidential.
Right.
So there's a whole sort system for that. The museums, on the other hand, do have a slightly different thing. We do not inherently get things from the federal government. Normally what happens is they say, okay, here are the physical objects of the presidency, and then they sort of determine which ones go to the museum. There's an entire presidential gift office that handles all of the stuff that gets given to a president, and there's so much of it. A significant chunk of our collection are just gifts that were given to the president that the gift office said, you can have them all. Jerry received like a huge number of inscribed footballs when he was president because he was a football player. So the different universities and sports teams would send him footballs with, thanks, Mr. President, doing a great job, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a large collection of footballs. We have also, though, the family of the president gives a lot of stuff. The campaign gave us a bunch of stuff. So we have campaign stuff from 76. We have gifts from the White House. Jerry gave us a whole bunch of stuff. Anytime he and Betty were like, I don't know what to do with this, give it to the museum. They clean out a closet instead of having a garage sale, it comes to the museum. That's cool because a lot of that stuff is really relevant for us. We have a large collection of Jerry's pipes. We don't have them all, but we have quite a few of them. And so that kind of thing. But we have, like, from the 76 campaign, we have this whole line of potholders that were emblazoned with, Ford's name and stuff. Ford in 76. We have a large collection of them. In fact, they're talking about getting rid of some of them, which is kind of tricky for museums to give up an object. It's called deaccessioning. And then I will actually get some of them so I can share them with kids and say, hey, look, try this on. It's a potholder. Now you can vote for Jerry in 76 is once you're 21 and have a time machine. Actually 18 by then. But so we have slightly different rules, but we have still all of the same rules that a regular museum has and more because we're a government museum. I wasn't kidding about that Omani falcon.
Right.
The nation of Oman has asked to borrow it for a display that they're doing at their national museum, and there's like a whole thing involved in that.
So does every presidential library have an accompanying museum?
Yes, of varying sizes. Because ours is a separate building, it's actually kind of bigger than some. Some are much bigger. The Reagan one is huge. It's a palace. Ours is just kind of a cute little thing sitting on the side of the river here in Grand Rapids. Much like Jerry was just sort of like, yeah, I'm just this guy. We are not a massive federal museum. We're just a nice exhibit space. Like I said, Fran, it'll go through in a couple hours. But it's a federal museum. We have all the federal regulations, but our public museum for the city is across the way, and it's a big competitor because they've got dinosaurs and a mummy, and so they get more school kids than we do. Sorry, it's hard to compete with a mummy and dinosaurs when you've got Jerry Ford and Betty Ford. They're cool people, but dinosaurs, come on. Where are you going to take the second graders?
Yeah. So I'm curious. I think I told you I went to the Truman Library a couple of years ago, and they had just they started the renovation right before COVID hit, and then it's like, well, or we're shut down anyway.
Yeah.
Let's do. So they really did a massive renovation.
Yes.
So does that go on all the time at different libraries as time, goes on?
Think of it as taking your turn. We did ours in 2016. It'll be a while before we get to do another one.
Okay.
There are limited funds for that kind of thing. And also some of the fundraising comes from those foundations.
Mm-hmm.
So we did a big overhaul in 2016 and also added an education wing, which was the money was raised by our foundation for that. The government was like, yes, we can help you redo the exhibits. You want to add a wing? That's not our thing.
Mm-hmm.
So our foundation helped us raise the money for the additional education wing. So yeah, that kind of thing rotates through federal museums. It's like, okay, you had one 20 years ago. Let's give you a new coat of paint. So that's part of it. like I said, 2016, we got it finished, opened it up, then spent a couple years closed for the pandemic. So that was a whole thing. Now, the tricky thing about doing construction during the pandemic was you actually had to socially distance all the construction workers, so it slowed everything down. But yeah, we do get the occasional refresh. More to the point, though, we have a temporary exhibit space where we create our own exhibits using funds raised by the foundation, because these are a lot cheaper. And we'll do an exhibit that's up for 9 months to a year and a half at most. Currently, we have one on the vice presidency because it was 50 years ago last year that Jerry became vice president. So we did one on the whole concept of vice presidency, which was originally just if you were first runner-up, you became vice president. So it's like, wait. So when Adams won, John Adams became the second president, Thomas Jefferson was running against him and lost and became vice president. Jefferson was not much pleased by that because these two really didn't like each other. That changed pretty quickly because they're like, yeah, this is a terrible system. The vice president and the president really hate each other. That's not great. So we have a whole exhibit on that. We're closing that one in June. And in August, we will be opening one on the presidency itself, because August is the 50th anniversary of Jerry becoming president. So we've got all our big Ford at 50 banners up right now. And we'll be rolling out that exhibit in August. And we're doing a night at a baseball stadium and handing out bobbleheads and all sorts of other fun stuff. You know, the things you do when you open a new exhibit.
So I have one more question before we wrap up, unless somebody else has something. One of the things, of course, that to me is very memorable about going to Truman's library is the continual reassessment of Truman's legacy and reputation.
Yeah.
So I would think that, history teaches us that, things look different when you're 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out, 50 years out. So do you find that that is also part of Ford's story as time has gone on?
Yes and no. There's always going to be historical reassessment. There's always going to be, hey, is this the case? Is that the case? One of the things that Jerry did when he got into office is because Nixon had become so reclusive by the end, because Nixon had developed an animosity relationship with the media and with all of his critics, Jerry did everything out in the open. He had open air bill signings. He would do everything he could to invite people in to see what he was doing. So it's not like a lot of new facts get revealed as we go along. Now, there are still classified papers that, are actually kept at the central office for the National Archives. When I go through a box of files in our archives, there will occasionally be a pink sheet says this page is classified, it's over in DC. Okay, so there are classified files. But mostly the things that Jerry did were so out in the open, there's not a lot of surprising new scholarship. We found out that he actually blah, blah. No, there's not much finding out. He was really open about everything he did. That doesn't mean we don't discuss these things and their relevance to today. We do annual series of, let's talk about Watergate. Let's talk about the pardon. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about that. It's not so much that things from then get reassessed. It's let's compare now to then. And now, of course, keeps moving forward. So the things in the past haven't changed and we don't get surprising new data, but our view of them changes as we talk about where we are now.
Our filter changes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I will tell you, Jerry Ford is incredibly active on social media, which is occasionally surprising to us since he's been dead for a while. But I don't know why he sort of hit the American zeitgeist as a fun and quirky, cool president. So we see him out there in reference to America's greatest living president, Gerald Ford, creator of the automobile. There's an entire meme for that. And it's just like, okay, you're wrong on multiple levels, but we're not going to argue with you because that's your whole point is you're making this crazy meme knowing it's wrong.
Right.
They also like to say that Benjamin Franklin is the second greatest ever president, like never a president. Okay, fine. So there's this whole meme community that's got on that. A couple months ago, I don't know if you know what cryptids are. Those are the semi-mythical creatures, the Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, etc. There was a competition for name your favorite big cryptid. Jerry Ford got some votes, and we were very curious who was having Jerry Ford sightings and where. But Jerry Ford is now up there with Bigfoot as a cryptid, apparently. So Jerry Ford just kind of shows up on social media in fun ways. We had a historian post several months ago, actually last year, professional historian, and she posted, whenever I find something new and interesting, I track it down as a professional historian, and I get my facts straight, and I have, I spent my entire lunch break just confirming something that I'd been believed to be true. And she put up a couple of pictures of young Jerry Ford. It says, turns out Jerry Ford was a hottie. And so I went to my boss because I was doing our social media at the time and said, can I just put up one of his pictures from when he was male modeling that's in our private collection? Because it was a personal photo that's in a family album. And she said, yeah, which one are you thinking? I said, the one where he's posing on the sailboat. She's like, oh yes, put that one up. So we put up this picture of Jerry Ford just sort of giving his smoldering look to the camera in a swimsuit on a sailboat on Lake Michigan. And we said, we're just going to leave this here. And the chain kicked off. People like, oh my God, that's Jerry Ford? It's like, yeah, back when he was a Cosmo model. So we get to have fun with it because, Gerald Ford was not President Gerald Ford for his entire life. And in fact, if it hadn't been the first season of Saturday Night Live and they were really looking for things to do, Jerry only fell down on that airplane once. It was a rainstorm. He was holding onto Betty's elbow and he was holding an umbrella and he wasn't holding the railing like Betty was. So he fell 3 steps down an airplane staircase in the rain. Chevy Chase ran with that and made hay with it for an entire season of Saturday Night Live. Now, the Ford White House is like, oh, we're being made fun of. Cool. He sent his press secretary to be on Saturday Night Live that season. And he recorded the bumper live from New York at Saturday night from the Oval Office. He sent them a tape to play of him saying live from New York at Saturday night. Cool. He had a good sense of humor, and we get to, celebrate that Jerry had a good sense of humor and liked a joke. So we don't have to be real stuffy. We actually have a picture of him after the presidency, after the museum opened. They did a program called Humor in the Presidency, talking about all of this stuff. We have a picture of him tripping Chevy Chase. Now, they staged it, but it was here in the museum, and Chevy's doing this whole, oh. But yeah, we have a picture of Jerry Ford tripping Chevy Chase, just because. So yeah, it's wonderful fun to work with a president who did not take himself too seriously and got the joke. So we can have fun with that.
He took the presidency very seriously. He just didn't take himself very seriously.
Correct. He took his job seriously. He did not mind when he got made fun of. In fact, he kind of loved it. But, he went to, there was a cartoonist named Oliphant.
Oliphanт, right?
Yeah, we're going to be doing some work with him because we've got a collection of those. Jerry liked collecting some of the original drawings. But he always depicted Jerry with a bandage on his forehead. So there was some conference or convention or something that they went to, and they were both there. And Oliphant drew the little bandage on Jerry's forehead. So my curator is currently tracking down a photograph of that because allegedly we have one somewhere in the collection, just of Gerald Ford with the little bandage drawn on his forehead in charcoal or something. So that's, kind of guy Jerry was.
Does anybody else have any comments? Marilyn, your hand's still up, so I don't know if that's something new or...
Yeah, I have one last. This is what I read. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. That when Reagan wanted Jerry Ford, or asked him, I'm not sure, if you definitely ask him, you can tell me that, to be his vice president. When Gerald Ford gave an interview, I think it was to Walter Cronkite, that I'm not sure, telling the person that he had been offered or was going to be offered, Reagan was furious. Now, I just read that. Is that right or wrong?
That's kind of edgy. There's a lot of he said, she said about how that whole thing went down, who was courting who, and so on and so forth. Each camp has a different read on it, and then you get like 6 more reads depending on who you ask about it.
Mm-hmm.
There were definitely discussions that Reagan did not like Ford leaking it, but at the same time, Ford really wasn't interested in becoming Reagan's vice president because Reagan had stiffed him. They were polite and cordial to each other, but they were not good friends the way Jerry and Jimmy were. And like I said, Nancy and Betty did not get along. So there was no love lost in those relationships.
Thank you.
You got it. I can neither confirm nor deny because you really have to have been in the room for that one.
Richard, thank you very, very much for all these wonderful stories and historical context. You know, lots of interesting things happening today, and you know, you look at it through this filter, and then there'll be others. And the information about how the National Archives came together was really helpful too. So thank you.
Sure, very much my pleasure. It's been a wonderful time talking to you all, and Keith, I just love the way you chortle. It's always fun to watch. I know I'm doing well when I'm cracking him up. But you all have wonderful days. Take care, and it's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.